She walked into the marble lobby of Alden Crest Financial, wearing a plain coat, a worn tote bag over one shoulder, and no name tag on her chest. Within minutes, 6 of the company's top executives had dismissed her, talked over her, and threatened to have security drag her out. Not one of them asked her name. Not one of them stopped long enough to check a single fact. For 45 minutes, they were absolutely certain she did not belong there. Then she walked into the boardroom, pulled out the chairman's seat, and sat down. Every one of them went pale. If that opening got your attention, you're going to want to stick around for the whole story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next and what it means for all of us. Her mother used to say that the most honest thing about a company wasn't its annual report or its lobby art or the way its executives shook hands at charity dinners. It was the 3 seconds between when a stranger walked through the front door and when someone decided whether or not to smile at them. Serena Vale had never forgotten that. She had spent most of her adult life thinking about it, on the early mornings when she reviewed acquisition files, before anyone else arrived at the office, on the long flights between cities, on the quiet nights when the work was done, and she sat alone with a cup of coffee and the particular kind of tiredness that doesn't come from the body. Her mother Lenora had cleaned corporate offices at night for nearly 2 decades. She knew the inside of boardrooms better than most executives ever would, not from the leather chair at the head of the table, but from behind the vacuum, moving carefully around furniture that cost more than a month of her wages. Lenora had learned to read a company by the things people left behind, the trash. They didn't bother to sort the coffee mugs they left for someone else to wash the notes they wrote, assuming no one important would ever read them. Serena had inherited that instinct. She just applied it differently. The acquisition of Alden Crest Financial had taken 14 months to finalize. It was the largest transaction Vale Meridian Capital had ever completed, a legacy firm with deep roots in Midtown Manhattan, 4 decades of institutional history, and a balance sheet that looked considerably healthier on paper than it did under scrutiny. Serena had read every document. She had reviewed every deposition. She had signed her name at the bottom of pages that transferred ownership of a company employing nearly 1,200 people, and she had done it all without once setting foot inside Alden Crest Tower. That was not an oversight. That was a decision. When her team had proposed the standard integration kickoff, a formal arrival, a prepared introduction, security detail, pressed the whole choreography of power, Serena had declined. She told Celeste Ardon, her senior executive assistant, to cancel the reception and say nothing to the Alden Crest leadership team, beyond confirming that the chairwoman would arrive for the 10:30 board meeting. No further details. No photograph. No description. The people who ran Alden Crest had been exchanging emails and legal documents with her name on them for over a year. They knew what she had built. What they didn't know was what she looked like when she walked into a room without someone announcing her first. That was the part she needed to see. On a Tuesday morning in October, Serena left her car 2 blocks from Alden Crest Tower and walked the rest of the way on foot. She wore a charcoal wool coat she had owned for 6 years, a pair of dark slacks and flat leather shoes. Her tote bag was practical and unbranded. She carried a manila folder of documents inside it, materials she had prepared for the board meeting, including her opening remarks as chairwoman. She wore no jewelry except a simple watch. She had not arranged for anyone to meet her downstairs. The lobby of Alden Crest Tower was the kind of space designed to remind you of your place in the world. The ceilings were high enough to induce a mild vertigo. The marble floors were polished to the point of reflection, so that anyone who crossed them could see a distorted version of themselves moving beneath their own feet. A reception desk of dark granite sat at the center, staffed by 2 young women in blazers. Behind it, a wall of frosted glass panels bore the company name in silver letters, each one backlit from within. Everything about the room said you are either someone who belongs here or you are not. Serena walked to the front desk. The receptionist who looked up was young, mid-20s at most, with careful posture and an expression that suggested she took her job seriously. Her name badge read Claire Benton. She greeted Serena with a professional smile and asked how she could help. Serena told her she had a 10:30 appointment. Claire typed something, typed again. The smile remained, but something behind it shifted slightly. She asked for a name. Serena Vale, Serena said. Claire scrolled again. She checked a second screen. She looked briefly uncertain in the way that people do when they know something is wrong, but aren't sure yet whose fault it is. She asked Serena to give her just a moment, that she wanted to make sure she had the right calendar, and would Serena mind having a seat while she sorted it out. Serena said she didn't mind at all. She took a seat on one of the long upholstered benches that faced the elevator bank and set her tote bag beside her. She placed the manila folder on her lap. She checked her watch. It was 9:47. She had time. She settled in and waited, and she watched the lobby the way her mother had once taught her, to watch a room not at the center of it, but at its edges where things happened, without anyone thinking to perform. The first person who noticed her was Nolan Price. He came through the elevator doors at a few minutes before 10, moving at the particular speed of someone who had a meeting to get to and considered the lobby an inconvenience between the parking garage and the executive floor. He was tall, well-dressed, carrying a coffee from a place that didn't use paper cups. His gaze swept the lobby the way people sweep rooms when they're not really looking, taking in shapes and surfaces rather than details. It landed on Serena and stopped. Not because he recognized her, because he didn't. He slowed his pace just enough to look at her the way someone looks at a thing that doesn't fit the pattern. Then he glanced at Claire behind the desk, as if the receptionist might explain what a woman in a plain coat was doing sitting on the executive lobby bench. Claire was still on the phone. Nolan turned back to Serena and said with a pleasantness that had nothing kind in it, that the delivery entrance was around the back on 53rd, and that the lobby wasn't really a waiting area for that kind of thing. Serena looked at him. She said she was waiting for a meeting. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided they're right. He said of course she was, and that someone downstairs could help her with whatever she needed. Then he stepped into the next elevator and was gone. Serena opened the manila folder and took out a small notepad she kept inside it. She wrote down his name. She had recognized him from the acquisition briefings, and the time and what he had said as closely as she could reconstruct it word for word. The second executive came less than 10 minutes later. Corbin Rourke was the chief operating officer, a man whose professional reputation rested largely on his ability to impose efficiency on complicated systems. He came out of the stairwell rather than the elevator, moving fast, already scanning his phone. He registered Serena's presence the same way Nolan had, as an anomaly. He didn't slow down. He said without looking up from the screen that the executive waiting area was reserved for scheduled guests, and that if she was looking for human resources, they were on the 12th floor. Serena said she was a scheduled guest. He glanced up at that. He looked at her coat, her bag, her folder. He looked at her the way people look when they're performing a calculation and don't bother to hide it. Then he said that the 12th floor could help her get sorted, and he pushed through the glass doors toward the street. Serena wrote his name and the time and what he had said. She was aware in the way she was always aware of things she would rather not feel, that something was pulling at the inside of her chest. Not anger exactly. She had learned to sit with anger a long time ago. It was something older than anger. It was the recognition of a specific kind of dismissal she had thought at this point in her life she had left behind her. She was 51 years old. She had spent the last 23 years building something that proved every single version of this moment wrong. And yet here was this moment again, as if time had not passed at all. She thought about her father, Martin. He had worked the floor of an automotive plant in Detroit for 18 years. He was a man of tremendous quiet dignity, the kind of man who never needed a room to know his value because he already knew it himself. He had died of a cardiac event at 54, still working, still carrying the weight of a life that had never given him enough room to breathe. There had been nothing fair about it, and no one who would ever answer for it. Serena had been 28 when it happened, and it was the moment she had decided with a clarity that had never left her that she would never again find herself powerless in a room. She had kept that promise to herself. Until this morning, she had almost forgotten what powerlessness felt like when it arrived wearing the face of ordinary condescension. The third executive was Leora Vance, chief financial officer. She came from the direction of the elevator bank and recognized Claire behind the reception desk, immediately lifting a hand in a short, practiced greeting. She had the polished composure of someone who had spent decades performing competence in rooms full of people who hadn't expected to find her there. Serena might have respected that in another context. But Leora's gaze crossed the lobby and settled on her with an expression that was not curiosity or concern. It was something more distilled, something that looked dressed in professional clothing, remarkably like contempt. Leora said, with a light laugh that was not a laugh that she wasn't sure who had let her up, but this floor was restricted. She said it kindly in the way that people say unkind things when they want credit for the delivery. Serena looked at her and said she had an appointment at 10:30. Leora's expression didn't change. She said she was certain someone downstairs could get that straightened out. Then she turned back toward the elevators and didn't look at Serena again. Serena wrote down her name. She wrote down the time. She wrote down the words, "I'm not sure who let you up," and the tone behind them as best as words could carry it. She looked down at the notepad. 3 names. 3 sets of words. 3 moments that had lasted in total less than 8 minutes. She thought about her mother coming home in the early mornings, coat smelling of cleaning solution, moving quietly through the kitchen so as not to wake anyone. Lenora had never complained. She had also never pretended that the people whose offices she cleaned treated her as if she fully existed. She had understood the transaction with a clarity that had nothing bitter in it, only honest. And she had told Serena once on a morning when Serena was frustrated by something she could no longer remember. Don't interrupt people when they're showing you who they are. Let them finish. Serena closed the notepad and set it back inside the folder. She was not going to announce herself. She was not going to stand up and watch 6 pairs of eyes rearrange their expressions when they learned what they had done. Not yet. Because this right now in this lobby with her name on their legal documents and her signature at the bottom of their acquisition papers, this was information. It was the most honest thing she had seen about Alden Crest Financial in 14 months of review, and she was not going to let it end before it was finished. She checked her watch. It was 10:14. She had 16 minutes before the board meeting. She settled her hands in her lap, kept her face still, and waited to see who would come next. She did not have to wait long. Maren Sloan arrived at 10:19. She came in through the main entrance rather than the elevators, which meant she had been outside and was returning a detail that would have been entirely unremarkable except for the way she moved through the lobby. She moved like someone who owned the floor she walked on, not in the aggressive sense, but in the settled, unconscious sense of a person who had never had reason to question whether a room would receive her. She pulled off a pair of leather gloves as she crossed toward the reception desk, caught sight of Serena on the bench, and stopped. Maren was the Vice President of People, a title that Serena had always found revealing when the person who held it turned out to be precisely the wrong kind of person to hold it. She looked at Serena the way a person looks at something that has been left in the wrong place by someone else's carelessness, not hostility, something that managed to be worse patient performance-grade pity. She told Serena in a voice calibrated to sound helpful that if she was here about a temporary position, the staffing coordinator was on the 3rd floor, and it would probably be more comfortable to wait down there. Serena looked at her steadily and said she was waiting for a 10:30 meeting. Maren's expression arranged itself into polite doubt. She said that the executive floor had a separate scheduling process, and that sometimes there were mix-ups, and that the 3rd floor really would be a much better place to get things sorted. She said all of this as if she were doing Serena a favor, as if the kindest possible outcome here was for Serena to gather her things quietly and find a more appropriate bench somewhere else in the building. Serena wrote down her name. She wrote down the time. She wrote down the phrase "mix-ups happen" because it was in its way the most precisely dishonest thing anyone had said to her all morning. There had been no mix-up. No one had checked whether there was a mix-up. They had simply looked at her and decided. Something moved through her that needed a moment to settle. She thought of her mother, not a specific memory, more like a presence. Lenora Vale had spent the better part of 2 decades in rooms like this one long after everyone else had gone home. She had polished these kinds of floors, emptied these kinds of wastebaskets, straightened these kinds of chairs. And every single morning she had come home with her dignity entirely intact, not because the work hadn't cost her anything, but because she had never once allowed someone else's assessment of her to become her own. Serena picked up the pen and kept writing. Leora Vance came back through the lobby at 10:22, and this time she didn't pretend to be helpful. She had apparently said something to Nolan in passing, because he appeared from the corridor behind her, and the two of them stood near the reception desk with the particular posture of people conducting a conversation. They want to seem casual, while ensuring that someone else is aware it's happening. Leora glanced at Serena and said clearly enough to be heard that she still hadn't left. Nolan said something low. Leora turned and addressed Serena directly that the longer she stayed, the more difficult this was going to become, and that she was only making things harder for herself. It was the kind of statement that assumed its own authority, that assumed the power in the room was arranged in a way that would eventually become uncomfortable for Serena rather than for them. Serena looked at Leora the way she looked at financial projections that didn't add up carefully, without expression, taking note of exactly where the reasoning had failed. She said nothing. That was when Ellis Grant set a cup of water on the bench beside her. He was one of the senior security officers, a man somewhere in his early 60s, with the quiet, unhurried bearing of someone who had seen enough of human behavior to have formed his opinions long ago. He didn't announce what he was doing. He didn't look at Leora or Nolan. He simply placed the paper cup within Serena's reach, straightened up, and walked back toward his post near the entrance. No explanation. No eye contact that might invite confrontation. Just the water sitting there as if the most ordinary thing in the world was to recognize that someone had been sitting for a long time and might be thirsty. Serena looked at the cup. In the middle of a morning that had been designed without anyone quite meaning to design it, to make her feel as though she did not exist in this room, a man she had never met had performed the one gesture that acknowledged she did. It was such a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. She felt something catch in her throat, not sentiment exactly, something more structural than that. A kind of clarity about what this morning was going to mean, and why it mattered that she stay in her seat until it was finished. She picked up the cup and drank. Graham Alden walked in at 10:26. He was 4 minutes late to a meeting that was nominally his to run. He was in his mid-60s with the physical confidence of a man who had never walked into a room without being the most expected person in it. The company bore his family's name on its facade. He had spent his entire career inside its walls. He moved through the lobby the way people move through spaces they have stopped seeing. Claire was on the phone. When she saw Graham, she put the call on hold and spoke quickly, in the careful voice of someone trying to get important information into a small window of time. There was a woman who had been waiting since before 10, who said she had a 10:30 appointment, and Claire hadn't been able to reach the correct scheduling contact to confirm. Graham barely broke stride. He glanced in the direction of the bench, not at Serena at the bench in the approximate way that one glances at furniture, and told Claire to have security escort the woman out before the board members started arriving. Then he moved toward the elevator corridor and stopped just short of it when Beatrice Lang appeared from the far side of the lobby. Serena watched the exchange between them, a short, tight conversation. She couldn't fully hear Beatrice gesturing once in her direction. Whatever was said, Graham didn't get into the elevator. He turned back toward the lobby and stayed. Serena looked down at her notepad. She thought about what she had just seen, not the individual rudeness of any one person, but the shape of the morning as a whole. The person responsible for human culture in this company had offered pity instead of protocol. The chief financial officer had returned twice to reinforce a dismissal she hadn't been asked to make. The CEO had not asked a single question before ordering her removed. In 4 seconds and 11 words, Graham Alden had shown her exactly what standard this organization was operating to, and it had come from the top. She thought about Claire still behind the desk, face flushed with the shame of having tried to do the right thing and been overruled. And she thought about everyone who had sat on a bench like this one before her people, with no acquisition paperwork in their folder and no badge to pull out people who simply needed to be treated like human beings and weren't. If she stood up right now and ended this quietly, nothing here would change. The next person who walked in wearing the wrong coat would get the same warning, and the person after them. Soon, she picked up the notepad and finished writing. At 10:29, Beatrice Lang walked toward Serena with purpose rather than coincidence, and the texture of the morning changed entirely. Beatrice was Alden Crest's general counsel, built professionally speaking out of the habit of anticipating liability. She placed herself between Serena and the elevator bank and said in a low, precise voice that this area was restricted to authorized personnel, that Serena had been asked multiple times to leave, and that if she did not do so immediately, she would be physically removed from the premises. Serena stood up, not because she was leaving, because some conversations require standing. She asked Beatrice in the same level tone she used in depositions and board presentations to state her full name and title for the record. Beatrice said that was not relevant. Behind her, Corbin Rourke stepped forward and reached for the manila folder on the bench, apparently deciding that the papers inside it were relevant to something. He got far enough to read the header on the top sheet before his expression shifted. The document read, in clean capital letters, introductory remarks from the board chair, Vale Meridian Capital. He closed the folder quickly and said it was probably fabricated. Nolan said, with a short laugh, that she was clearly fishing for a settlement. Marin, who had come back into the lobby, said that if Serena didn't walk out on her own, the next step would involve handcuffs and a police report. Beatrice confirmed that security had been authorized to make physical contact if necessary. Graham said from where he had repositioned himself near the reception desk that this was her final opportunity. Either she walked out through the front door or she would be removed. The five of them arranged themselves in the particular formation that people arrange themselves in when they want to communicate inevitability. A younger security officer, a man in his late 20s who was very clearly following instructions he had been given in the last 3 minutes, stepped forward and placed his hand on Serena's arm. Claire made a sound from behind the reception desk. Not a word, the sound a person makes when something they've been dreading actually happens. She said to Graham that she really thought someone should call upstairs first, that something didn't feel right, that she wanted to try one phone number. Graham told her without looking at her that if she made that call, he would have her removed from her position before lunch. Ellis Grant spoke from across the lobby. He said quietly, but without softness, that in his experience it was worth taking 60 seconds to verify a visitor's credentials before escalating, and that he would personally make the call if no one else was willing. Graham turned and told him to return to his post and stay out of a conversation that didn't concern him. Ellis did not move back to his post. He stayed exactly where he was and said nothing further, but he stayed. Serena looked at him. Then she looked at Claire, who was standing very still behind the desk, with her hands flat on the granite surface, trying to hold herself together. These two people, the receptionist who had been professional and careful from the first minute, and the security officer who had placed a cup of water on a bench and then refused to leave when someone needed a witness, were the only honest data points this lobby had produced all morning. Earlier, while waiting and writing her notes, she had sent a single text to Celeste upstairs. "Don't come down. I'll explain when I get there. Make sure the security footage from this morning is accessible." 3 sentences. That was all Celeste had needed. Serena had what she needed too. She looked at the 6 people standing between her and the elevator and said very clearly, "I'll come up with you." No one responded immediately. The younger security officer took his hand off her arm. Serena reached into the inside pocket of her charcoal coat and removed a small rectangular badge on a retractable clip. It bore the logo of Vale Meridian Capital, a clean geometric design she had approved herself 8 years ago. She attached it to the lapel of her coat with a small, precise click that carried in the silence of the lobby like something being locked into place. She picked up her tote bag. She picked up the manila folder. She walked to the elevator and pressed the call button, and when the doors opened, she stepped aside and looked back at Graham Alden and the 5 executives standing behind him. "After you," she said. No one spoke in the elevator. That was the thing Serena noticed most, not the stillness, Not the way Graham Alden had positioned himself in the far corner, as if distance might reclassify what had just happened, but the quality of the silence itself. It was not the comfortable silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of 6 people doing rapid private calculations and finding that none of the numbers were working in their favor. Leora had attempted something when the doors first closed, a short remark about a misunderstanding, something about how these things happen in large organizations during transitions. Serena looked at her and said she preferred quiet for the ride up. Leora did not speak again. The elevator rose 43 floors in less than a minute. In that minute, Serena looked straight ahead at the brushed metal doors and thought about nothing in particular. That was a skill she had developed over many years, the ability to be completely present in her own stillness while everything around her moved. The moment you start filling silence with your own noise is the moment you stop hearing what the room is trying to tell you. The doors opened. Celeste Ardon was standing in the corridor outside the elevator bank holding a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of a person who had been doing this job long enough to have seen most things, but had still managed to be quietly startled by how this particular morning had unfolded. She was in her mid-40s, precise in everything she did, and she had worked alongside Serena for 11 years. She looked at the group that emerged from the elevator, Serena first, then 6 executives arranged behind her in the involuntary formation of people who don't know where else to stand, and she said clearly, and without any particular emphasis, "Chairwoman Vale, the board is ready for you." The word chairwoman moved through the corridor the way a key moves through a lock. Serena watched it land on each of them in sequence. Graham's expression didn't collapse. All at once it rearranged itself slowly, the way a structure shifts before it falls, each element moving out of alignment with the next, until nothing was holding together the way it had been. Leora brought one hand briefly to her mouth before catching herself. Corbin went very still. Nolan turned slightly to one side as if looking for an exit the hallway wasn't going to provide. Marin said nothing, but the color left her face in a way that was visible even in the corridor's warm light. Beatrice, who had built a career on composure under pressure, held her expression longest, but not quite long enough. Serena nodded once at Celeste and walked. The corridor on the 43rd floor ran the length of the building and was lined on one side with framed portraits, the people who had run Alden Crest Financial across its 4 decades of existence. Board members, founding partners, the kind of institutional memory that companies put on walls to remind themselves where they came from. Serena walked past each one without slowing. She had seen these photographs before in the due diligence files. She was going to be adding something to this corridor before the year was out, and it was not going to be another portrait. The boardroom was at the end of the hall. It was a large room with a long oval table, high-backed chairs in dark leather, and a wall of windows that looked out over Midtown Manhattan at a height that made the city feel simultaneously vast and manageable. The board members were already seated people who had been part of the acquisition process and knew exactly who Serena was. They looked up when she entered, then past her at the 6 executives filing in behind her, and something in their collective expression said that the morning had already told them something they hadn't expected to learn. Serena walked to the end of the table. She pulled out the chair at the head, the chairman's chair, the one that had been placed there in preparation for this meeting, and she sat down. She set her tote bag on the floor, placed the manila folder on the table in front of her, and looked at Graham, Leora, Corbin, Marin, Nolan, and Beatrice, who were still standing near the door. She told them there were chairs along the wall if they wanted to sit. Not at the table. Along the wall. Graham moved first, and whatever he had been preparing to say since the elevator, he said it now that there had been a misunderstanding, that no one had been provided a photograph or a physical description, that in a building this size with the volume of visitors they managed daily, it was simply not possible to. Serena stopped him by saying his name once without inflection. "Mr. Alden," she said. "You're correct. You didn't know. For 45 minutes you didn't know, and that is the entire problem." She asked Celeste to pull up the security footage from the lobby. Celeste had already cued it, as Serena's text that morning had requested. What appeared on the screen was not a highlights reel. It was the full, unedited record time-stamped continuous beginning from the moment Serena had walked through the front doors of Alden Crest Tower and ending with the elevator doors closing on all 7 of them. The board watched it without speaking. The 6 executives along the wall watched it too. There was no version of the footage that could be argued with, because it was simply what had happened. Every remark, every dismissal, every threat, every moment that the younger security officer's hand had been placed on Serena's arm, and every moment that Claire Benton had tried to intervene and been told her job was at stake if she did. When it ended, the room was very quiet. Graham made one more attempt. He said that whatever it looked like, the intent had not been, and Serena told him with a patience that had nothing gentle in it, that intent was not the standard she was applying. Behavior was the standard, and the behavior was on the screen. She opened the manila folder and removed the acquisition agreement, the relevant section, the clause that granted the chairwoman of Vale Meridian Capital full authority over executive personnel decisions at Alden Crest Financial during the transition period, pending board ratification. She read the marked paragraph aloud, not because anyone in the room was unfamiliar with it, but because some things need to be said in a room before they become real. Then she said 6 names in the same order she had encountered them that morning and gave 6 decisions. Nolan Price terminated effective immediately for cause. Corbin Rourke terminated effective immediately for cause. Leora Vance terminated effective immediately for cause. Maren Sloan terminated effective immediately for cause. Graham Alden terminated effective immediately for cause. Beatrice Lang terminated effective immediately for cause. The grounds were the same for all 6: abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming of a senior leader creating a hostile environment for a visitor on company property, and generating material, reputational, and legal risk for the organization. The terms of their exits had already been reviewed by outside counsel. There would be no severance. The bonuses they were owed for the current fiscal year would be forfeited under the conduct clause in each of their individual employment agreements, the clause that every one of them had signed, and that not one of them had ever expected to apply to themselves. Graham said the family name. He said it as though it were an argument, as though the letters on the building outside transferred to him some immunity that the morning ought to have respected. Serena said that a name on a building was not a character reference, and that legacies built on 4 decades of institutional history did not survive the kind of systemic failures the audit team would be presenting to the board over the coming weeks. Maren said she had a family. She said it the way people say it when they mean surely this changes the calculation. Serena looked at her directly before responding, really looked at her in the way she had not allowed herself to look at any of them all morning. She said that Maren had spent years in charge of the human infrastructure of this organization, that the people most responsible for maintaining dignity in a workplace were the people most directly accountable when it was missing, that this was not a situation she was willing to manage around. Beatrice said the word litigation in a way intended to function as a threat. Serena set down her pen, folded her hands on the table, and walked her through it methodically. The security footage, the written record she had maintained throughout the morning, with timestamps, the testimony of Claire Benton, the testimony of Ellis Grant, and the documentation her legal team had been compiling since Celeste received her text that morning. She said Beatrice was welcome to pursue whatever course she thought advisable. She said it with the equanimity of someone who had already run the numbers. After that, no one said anything further. Building security escorted all 6 out of the room. They took the same elevator back down to the lobby. They crossed the same marble floor. They passed the same reception desk. Claire Benton was back at her post and did not look up as they crossed toward the exit. She kept her eyes on her screen with the careful stillness of someone who had decided that professionalism was the highest form of dignity available to her in that moment. 2 announcements went out to staff within the hour. The first confirmed that 6 members of Alden Crest's senior leadership team had been separated from the company effective that morning, and that an interim structure would be communicated before the close of business. The second announced 2 personnel changes. Claire Benton was being appointed executive assistant to the chairwoman. Ellis Grant was being promoted to Director of Workplace Safety, a newly formalized position reporting directly to the incoming Chief Operating Officer. Serena sent both announcements herself from the chairman's seat at the head of the oval table. The post-acquisition audit launched the following week confirmed what the lobby had already suggested. Behind Alden Crest was a decade's worth of promotion decisions, weighted toward a specific profile performance reviews that documented compliance more than contribution, client file irregularities that had been flagged internally and quietly buried, and a culture of unchecked seniority that had made it possible for 6 people at the top to behave the way they had behaved all morning without anyone below them feeling safe enough to say, "This is wrong." The audit led to formal proceedings, financial penalties, and industry-level sanctions for several of the 6. A remediation fund was established for employees and clients who had been directly affected. None of that was resolved quickly. Serena had not expected it to be. The day after the board meeting, the sign above the building entrance came down. The silver letters that had spelled out Alden Crest Financial for 40 years were replaced simply and without ceremony by Vale Meridian Capital, and a single line beneath it, a new standard. A week later, Serena stood in the center of the lobby, the same marble floor, and spoke to 1,200 employees without a podium, without notes, without a microphone. She said she had not come to that building the previous Tuesday to trap anyone or to embarrass anyone. She had come because the fastest way to understand what a company truly is to walk through its front door as someone it does not expect to matter. From that day forward, she said one principle would govern everyone who walked through those doors. Every person, regardless of what they were wearing, where they came from, or how they were perceived, would be treated as if they might be the most important person in the building. Not because they might have power, but because they were already a human being, and that had always been enough. She had a small plaque installed beside the reception desk. It read, "For Claire Benton, who saw her." Claire was standing in the crowd when it was unveiled. She pressed one hand to her chest and couldn't find any words. She didn't need them. That evening, after the building had settled into the quiet of a place that knows it has crossed a threshold, Serena stood alone at the windows on the 43rd floor and looked out at the city below. The lights of Midtown were coming on in the early dark, indifferent and magnificent, entirely unconcerned with what had happened inside this building that week. Celeste came in without knocking, the only way she ever entered a room when Serena was at the end of a long day, and set something on the table behind her. It was a ceramic mug, the one that lived on the corner of Serena's desk at her own office across town, slightly chipped on one side, the one that had belonged to her mother for nearly 20 years, before Lenora had pressed it into Serena's hands the morning she left for her first real job. Celeste had brought it without being asked, because after 11 years, she understood certain things without needing them said. Serena picked it up and held it with both hands, careful of the chip, the way she always did. She looked out at the city and felt underneath the tiredness and the clarity and the long specific weight of the week something that didn't have a clean name. Not triumph, not relief. Something more like the sound of a door closing properly, quiet, conclusive, finally seated in the frame where it was always meant to be. She had not come here to win. She had come to find out the truth about a company she had taken responsibility for. The truth had presented itself within the first 10 minutes more completely than any audit ever could, and she had stayed long enough to let it finish. Outside the windows, the city moved on. Inside, for the first time since she had walked through the front doors that Tuesday morning, Serena Vale allowed herself to be still. That's the story of Serena Vale. And if it left you thinking about how you treat people when you think no one important is watching, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. The way we treat strangers, people we think don't matter, people we've already decided don't belong, and that is the truest measure of who we are. Not the title on the door, not the name on the building. Just the 3 seconds between when someone walks in and when we decide whether or not to see them. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe to the channel, because every week we bring you stories that remind us what integrity, dignity, and real leadership actually look like. We'll see you in the next one.